Hey everyone, welcome to Judging for the Win. I'm Dave, and this is my daily ruling. Today is this month's patron pick. Thank you so much to all of my wonderful supporters on Patreon. The topic that was chosen this time is a pure rules question. Now that's a bit rare for the patrons to pick, so you know it must be a good one. Amy plays Grist the Hunger Tide, Nick responds with Dress Down. How many loyalty counters does Grist enter with? So I'd like to build my way to an answer to this question by starting out with a related but somewhat simpler scenario, and then considering how things change when we apply the rules that we learned to the scenario from the original problem statement. Amy plays Adaptive Shimmerer while there's a Dress Down out. How many +1/+1 counters does it enter with? Now, even if you already know the answer, I want you to think about exactly what's going on here because it's going to be important for the next question that we're going to consider. First, let's recall that effects that have a permanent enter with counters on them are replacement effects. Does this mean Adaptive Shimmerer has a replacement effect? Well, not quite. The text, this creature enters with 3 +1/+1 counters on it, on Adaptive Shimmerer is a static ability. Static abilities create continuous effects, some of which are replacement effects. If you're wondering how something can be both a continuous effect and a replacement effect at the same time, remember that continuous effects does not just include the things that happen in layers and modify the characteristics and controller of permanence. Even though this is what most people think of when you say continuous effects, that rules topic also includes anything that affects players or the rules of the game, such as changing it so that a creature enters with a +1/+1 counter on it. You probably never thought of Thalia, Guardian of Thraben, as having an ability that generates a continuous effect, but it does. In fact, according to this definition, both of its abilities do. So now I'm spelling all this out because in most cases this stuff doesn't really affect the answer to anything. So many people, even judges and others with advanced rules knowledge, are a little bit shaky on these details. This question is one of the ones, though, that requires precise understanding of these underlying rule structures, so I thought it would be worth a refresher. As Adaptive Shimmerer is entering the battlefield, the game needs to decide whether there are any replacement effects that apply to this event. This determination is made immediately before the Adaptive Shimmerer enters, and at first, this might look like a problem. Abilities of creatures generally only apply on the battlefield. There are exceptions to this, but none of them are relevant to the scenario we're presently considering. Therefore, we can say that while Adaptive Shimmerer is on the battlefield, its static ability will generate a continuous effect that changes the rules of the game so that Adaptive Shimmerer will enter with 3 counters on it. Except, well, that's not really a very useful ability to have if the Shimmerer is already on the battlefield, is it? So now I'm ready to introduce the boss rule at the center of this scenario, which spells out exactly what process the game uses to reconcile this apparent contradiction. Actually, that's pretty long, so I'll just cut out the parts that are irrelevant to this discussion to make it a little bit easier to focus. Immediately before the card that's entering the battlefield changes zones, the game has to determine which replacement effects apply to that event and how they apply. To do this, check the characteristics of the card as it would exist on the battlefield. Now, on the battlefield, Adaptive Shimmerer has an ability that generates a replacement effect, so this replacement effect is able to apply to the event of Adaptive Shimmerer entering the battlefield. And the event of the creature entering is replaced by the event of the creature entering with 3 +1/+1 counters on it. Let's say that you play Adaptive Shimmerer when there's a Dress Down out. While the game is checking which replacement effects are applicable, it looks at what characteristics Adaptive Shimmerer would have on the battlefield, but hold on, one of those irrelevant details that I omitted earlier has now become relevant. When doing this, it takes into account continuous effects that already exist and would apply to it. So when the game is checking to see if there are any replacement effects to apply, this is what it sees. Nope, no replacement effects to apply to this event. Let's just put that 0/0 right onto the battlefield then. And of course, the Adaptive Shimmerer will die right away because it has 0 toughness. Okay, so with all of that set, we've got a good foundation to bring the Grist back and tackle the situation from the original problem statement. So let's say Grist is entering the battlefield. The game needs to know whether there is any replacement effects that need to apply to this scenario. Yes, there are. You might not be able to see it, but trust me, it's there. All Planeswalkers inherently have an ability that causes them to enter with loyalty counters equal to the number in the bottom right corner. Okay, but hold on, because there's also a Dress Down in play. This removes all abilities from creatures, as in not just the ones printed on it. It also gets the inherent abilities too. So the only thing left to do is identify whether the Dress Down applies to Grist while this check is happening. Okay, so while this check is going on, you consider the characteristics of Grist as it would exist on the battlefield, and you take into account any continuous effects from the permanent's own static abilities and from effects that already exist and would apply to it. At this point, we encounter the real heart of this problem. Some of the colleagues and internet commenters that I surveyed were of the opinion that during this check, the game imagines what Grist will look like on the battlefield, sees that it will not be a creature, and therefore concludes that dress down will not apply to it. Others observed that this determination is made immediately before Grist actually enters the battlefield. Accordingly, they say, although the game is imagining what the Grist would look like on the battlefield, the Grist's top ability will still be making it a creature at this time because it is not physically on the battlefield yet, so the dress down would apply. Note that due to how layers work, type-changing effects, such as Grists, always apply before ability-removing effects, such as dress downs, so there's no issue caused by the dress down removing the top ability from Grist. This is similar to how abilities of cards like Magus of the Moon still work with dress down out. Check out my video on dress down and Dryad of the Elysian Grove for a fuller explanation on this point. So, which interpretation is correct? Well, if you're familiar with another ruling from the Judge Vault, that certainly lends some credibility to the latter interpretation. If you play a Thassa while you have 4 devotion to blue and your opponent controls an imposing sovereign, the Thassa will enter untapped. Now to see why, let's go through exactly what actually happens in the game. While deciding whether any replacement effects, such as the one from imposing sovereign's ability, apply to the event of Thassa entering, it checks the characteristics of Thassa as it would exist on the battlefield, taking into account the continuous effect from Thassa's own static ability. Thassa is not a creature if your devotion to blue is less than 5. Thassa is not officially on the battlefield yet at the time that this check is happening. The game is just imagining what Thassa would look like. Therefore, your devotion to blue is still only 4, so Thassa is not a creature. Therefore, the game determines no replacement effects are applicable to this event. Now, if we recall the situation from the original problem statement, it seems like there's some pretty strong parallels to that one. When we're determining what replacement effects apply to the event of Grist entering the battlefield, we check the characteristics of Grist as it would exist on the battlefield. But Grist is not physically on the battlefield yet, so the ability makes it a creature, which means dress down should apply to it and make it lose all of its abilities, including the inherent one that generates the replacement effect that makes it enter with loyalty counters on it. Seems pretty solid. But if we look a little bit deeper though, that reveals some cracks in this argument. Let's think carefully about what's actually happening. When the game is deciding what replacement effects apply to the event of Grist entering, it imagines a purely hypothetical Grist on the battlefield and checks that Grist's characteristics. It's true that at this point, the actual Grist is not yet on the battlefield, and therefore it is still a creature. But the game is not looking at the actual Grist's characteristics. It's looking at the characteristics of the hypothetical Grist it's imagining on the battlefield. Now, you could maybe make the argument that hypothetical Grist isn't really on the battlefield. Heck, it isn't actually really in any game zone. So its top ability should be making it a creature. But if we check the actual text of the rule that we are looking at, we find that we're checking the characteristics of the hypothetical Grist, taking into account continuous effects from its own static abilities that would apply to it once it's on the battlefield. Now, it seems to me like it'd be a little bit of a stretch to say that Grist could be considered a creature based on this standard. That being the case, my ruling is the Grist should enter the battlefield with 3 loyalty counters on it entirely normally. The dress down does not affect this event at all. So this ruling was very subtle and definitely a very interesting one. I'm told that even Modo and Arena differ in their answers, which I'm sure is behind some of the confusion. I hope that my explanation made sense, and if not, I'd love to see your comments on whether or not it was convincing and what parts were. That's all I have for you today. How did you do? Thank you again to all of my lovely supporters on Patreon. Join me again next time for another ruling. Until then, I hope you have a great day.